So, hello and welcome to this session. My name is Laila Darouich. I'm a research associate at Perspectives Climate Research, and I want to thank you all for coming here today, online and in person. In this session, we will explore the potential of debt for climate swaps as an innovative climate finance instrument. We will examine international experience gained from past transactions and discuss the associated opportunities and pitfalls with our panelists and with you, the audience. So I'm joined here today by my four colleagues with whom I will be discussing this interesting topic. To my left, we have Seychelles. Seychelles is a senior researcher at the International Institute for Environment and Development with experience in public policy analysis, climate finance, and climate resilient development. Seychelles is working on the topic of sovereign debt and debt swaps for many years and authored several related studies. Seychelles will present her research at IIED with a focus on a programmatic approach for debt for nature and climate swaps. Next, we have Andrew. Andrew is the managing director for global policy and conservation finance at the Nature Conservancy. He is an expert in international environmental law, policy and diplomacy, and has been involved in the oversight and structuring of recent debt swaps, for example, in Belize, Barbados, and Gabon. Andrew will elaborate on the role of the Nature Conservancy in these recent deals and give us some insights on their structure. Next in the order of presentations, we have Didier. Didier has served as the Minister of Environment of the Seychelles and was one of the architects behind the 2015 Seychelles Debt for Climate Swap. He is currently working as a sustainable development consultant and at Inspire for Future, and Didier will provide us with insights and lessons learned from the debt swap of the Seychelles. And our last panelist is Danielle. Danielle is the former Minister of Environment of Ecuador and currently is serving as the co-chair of the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market and is also director of the sustainability company Biocarbon. Danielle has over 15 years of experience in climate change policy and published several articles on debt swaps. Danielle will show us one way how to reform the current debt swap model by linking it to high integrity carbon credits to increase their robustness and environmental integrity. Lastly, myself, as mentioned, my name is Laila, and I'm working for 4 years now at Perspectives, mostly on climate finance related topics, adaptation, and UNFCCC negotiations. A bit of background on why we organized the side event. So in our climate finance team, we recently started to have a closer look on debt swaps and wrote a research report on the topic, which we are launching today. And in the end of this presentation, I will also give you a QR code so that you can access the publication if you want to. And in this publication, we focus on the opportunities and challenges of debt swaps, but also looking at the potential of them to fill the climate finance gap. So clear focus on climate finance, not so much on the debt for nature swaps of the past. Some housekeeping rules before we start. We will use the tool Slido to collect questions during the presentations. So you can scan the QR code here that I put on the slide, write down your question. So there's no registration necessary or anything for the tool. You just you write down your question, indicate to whom the question is directed. So that would really help then in the end, and provide your name and affiliation if you choose. That's voluntary, of course. And then in the Q&A session in the end, we will try to answer all the questions. And if we don't have time enough, because we also started a bit late, perhaps I can pass down your messages to our panelists who might be able to give you a written reply at a later point. And of course, if someone does not want to use the tool, you can raise your hand in the end and we do it the old school way. So, why debt for climate swaps? Let me stress that we are facing a global, multiple crises at the same time. So for one, we received the news a couple of days ago that 2023 is the hottest year on record. We all know that extreme events are becoming more frequent and severe, and at the same time, we do not have enough finance provided for the most vulnerable countries to adapt to the negative effects of climate change and achieve a low-carbon, climate-resilient development. On top of that, there's a huge debt crisis ongoing in many climate-vulnerable low-income countries that are already at risk or already in debt distress. As in yesterday's echo that I put here on the right side, you can see an article in which Kenya's president is warning that the high debt burden and increasing interest rates bring countries in the global south closer to defaulting on their debt and impede investment in climate action. As a consequence, there is a demand for developing countries to receive climate finance, which does not add to the debt burden of countries. This was also stressed in today's draft decision text of the Global Goal on Adaptation, as the financial resources for adaptation significantly lag behind those of mitigation. This situation is, of course, worsened by the fact that most of climate finance is provided in form of debt-increasing loans and only a very small part in grants. This all leads to a vicious cycle in which developing countries' ability to invest in addressing climate change is constrained by the need to service their debt, and meanwhile the negative impacts of climate change, such as the massive floods that we saw, for example, in Pakistan last year, necessitate further borrowing to cope with these consequences, often at a higher price, leading to more debt and even less physical space for climate investment in the countries. So one of the financial instruments that received a lot of attention in the last years and months are the so-called debt for climate swaps. The idea of conditional debt relief is not new per se. So debt for nature swaps are implemented since the late 1980s and have been mostly oriented towards terrestrial conservation measures. The objective of debt for climate swaps is that a country can repay its sovereign debt on better terms and at the same time unlock physical space to invest in climate measures domestically. One of the advantages for debt for climate swaps is that, for example, countries that are not eligible for comprehensive debt cancellation or typically don't receive grant-based climate finance can invest in climate measures without increasing their external debt burden. There are currently three debt swap models that are being implemented, and I tried to explain them as simple as possible. It took me a while to understand them myself. So the first one is the one that is the easiest. It's the bilateral swap, in which a creditor country either forgives some of the existing debt or offers a new debt with better terms, and in return, the debtor country agrees to allocate funds in its own currency for a climate action. In the case of a tripartite swap or multi-party swap, third parties, usually one or more NGOs or philanthropies, purchase discounted debt from a developing country on a secondary market, and in the next step, the third party lends the debtor country the funds at below interest rates, and in return receives a commitment that the funds will be allocated to climate finance or are invested directly in a fund which then invests in climate measures. Then there's also a new model, which we will hear more about from Andrew. In this model, it's more similar to the tripartite model, but focuses mostly on bond debt. And here we use credit enhancement tools such as guarantees on interest payments to reduce the risks for potential investors, and also allow the governments to issue then blue bonds for marine conservation measures, or also green bonds for more terrestrial measures, and this with a better credit rating. Now some facts on the history of debt swaps. So in total, more than 150 debt for nature and climate swaps have been implemented, with a volume of around 6.4 billion US dollars in treated debt. In our analysis of the transactions, we only found few swaps that were really associated and linked to climate measures. But I also have to say we couldn't find for all the swaps a lot of information, so we had a smaller sample size to look at, for which we could find details. And one also has to stress that conservation was the focus of the first waves of swaps, and now they are more focusing on a mix of climate and conservation. But many stakeholders in the past highlighted that high transaction costs, the lengthy process of negotiating the deals, lack of inclusivity in country ownership are one of the downsides associated with these swaps. Maybe also one interesting point that I also wanted to put on the table is that most of the swaps have so far been implemented in Latin America, small island states, and also in African countries. So quickly, most of the points I also mentioned on my prior slide is offering the transition to my next speaker, Seychelles, by saying that many of these challenges that I just mentioned led to stakeholders calling for a reform of debt swaps, of how they are treated, how they are performed so far. And now I would give the floor to Seychelles to explain one of these ideas. Here, just the link to the report. Yeah.
Great, thanks Laila, and it's great to be here. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about some of the work we've been doing on taking a programmatic approach to debt for climate and nature swaps. So as Laila's been explaining, this is an instrument that is working in the space of trying to address the triple crisis of debt, climate, and biodiversity. And just to step back a bit and look at the current economic situation, debt stocks have been significantly rising in the recent years due to loss and damage from the climate impacts, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the 2022 food and energy price surges. So it's set up in quite a bad economic situation that's led to quite a sharp rise in the recent years. And looking at the history of debt swaps, they arose as an innovation in the late 80s and 90s when the debt was building up and rising at a quite a fast pace. And then we had the highly indebted poor countries initiative, the multilateral debt relief initiative, and the Brady bonds come in and support large-scale debt cancellation. So the need for these kind of smaller debt swaps was greatly reduced, and we saw a drop-off in these instruments like Laila was showing. And then we can see in this graph that from the 2009 financial crisis, debt stocks have again been rising sharply. So we're again in this situation where debt stocks are restricting countries' abilities to undertake climate-resilient sustainable development, and there isn't at the moment the political appetite for a large-scale debt relief initiative like HIPIC, even though 60% of low-income countries are at high risk or are already in debt distress. So what exactly are debt swaps? Fundamentally, debt swaps are a transaction where debt is reduced and investment in climate and nature is increased. And this can happen in a number of ways. So it could be that a creditor and a debtor agree to convert the debt in some form. It could be buying back the debt at a cheaper rate on a secondary market, or supporting the conversion to a different financial vehicle. The point is it's a very broad term, and the way it's approached has a bearing on whether it takes the approach of a debt cancellation initiative like HIPIC, or it takes a sort of an approach that moves away from country ownership and social and economic benefits. So many swaps have been heavily criticized, and rightly so, for their lack of country ownership, the imposition of outside interests on environmental actions, the lack of involvement in civil society, the conditionalities that can be set up in these types of transactions, high transaction costs, the scale, which has typically been very small. So there are a number of sort of criticisms coming from the experiences of swaps so far. And I guess our perspective is that swaps are a tool like any other. So you also need to be applying good practice in finance and delivery. So I'm going to talk through 4 components of debt swaps that we think make them more programmatic and make them closer to this sort of good practice approach of debt cancellation and close to HIPIC. So firstly, we think swaps should be based on KPIs that are decided by the debtor country in accordance to their national commitments. So those may be commitments that are presented in NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, or the national biodiversity strategies and action plans, where those have been developed through broad and inclusive processes in country. These priorities should be integrated as part of national development objectives. These indicators should then be tracked through transparent verification systems and with independent verification mechanisms. And this approach allows for results-based budgeting. And the purpose of having KPIs is on the creditor side that they can measure and monitor policy commitments and climate and nature outcomes and processes. And on the debtor side, it's as well as demonstrating policy commitments and climate and nature outcomes and processes is to be held accountable to these commitments by national stakeholders. The second component is using budget support. So the fund should be managed through the debtor countries' government systems and budget systems where, with accountability through fiduciary standards. For example, through the use of climate and nature budget tagging systems. This allows for a larger amount of funds to be swapped, increases debtor government ownership, and helps to shift the accountability to national citizens over creditor interests. Using national systems brings multiple broader benefits, like institutionalizing climate actions, strengthening national systems, and supporting steady and predictable financing streams for climate and nature. It also helps to bring together cross-ministry approaches, and generally ministries of finance are not involved with the technical aspects of responding to and budgeting for climate change. So this helps sensitize them to some of the sort of nuances to doing so. And here we have some examples of budget support that are being used now and previously. So for example, we have the IMF balance of payments and macroeconomic support, which is paid in installments linked to policy actions and periodic reviews. And then some others, and it's good to learn from these kind of tools which are already being used. The third component is that swaps should support the freeing up of resources. So this means that the full amount freed up from a swap should not go to climate and nature purposes. So IAD recently did a study on what scale of funding could be mobilized from implementing a HIPIC type approach to debt for climate and nature. In that study, we looked at the average amounts flowing to poverty reduction from the debt cancellations that took place under HIPIC, MIDRI, and the Brady bonds. And we found that 26.3% on average flowed to poverty reduction from those initiatives. The rest of the money goes to free up pressures on fiscal space and to other national priority areas. So we're arguing that it's realistic that a similar proportion of a debt swap or cancellation should be earmarked for investment in poverty reduction and promotion of growth, which would now include climate and nature investment. And that's to relieve some of the pressure on the country on their fiscal circumstances. And we estimated that if you take this approach to the calculation and look at a wide-scale debt cancellation across 55 developing countries, you could mobilize upwards of $105 billion US. And finally, the fourth component is taking a comprehensive all-creditors approach. So this means bringing in public, multilateral, and private sector debt. The multilateral agencies are not keen at the moment to undertake debt cancellations, as far as I've heard, we've seen. So there's some way to go on bringing them on board and unlocking some of that. And the same with the private sector creditors. And we saw on that graph earlier that the proportion of debt that private creditors holds is now significantly more than it was back during the HIPIC period. So it's important to create incentives that can help bring them in. So just to summarize a bit, that achieving country-owned large-scale debt relief calls for funding to be managed as performance-based payments based on KPIs developed from the debtor country commitments, use the budget support modality based on inclusive and development integrated objectives and country fiscal context, and build it into the international architecture, which would help legitimize these instruments and help enable checks and regulations on how they're structured, and help bring them, also bring along different types of creditors to the table, and ensure you're covering a large volume of debt. And doing this can lead to a number of economic benefits, so expanded fiscal space in the debtor country's government budget, increased investment for climate and nature, growth is increased through sustainable investments. There should be a reduction in the debt stock sufficient to improve debt sustainability, and a decline in poverty through pro-poor investments. And then just to sort of look at the landscape of actors, I won't go into this, but just to sort of note that there is a demand side and there's various incentives for debtor countries and their governments. There's a whole supply side sort of aspect to this, and then there's a number of different agencies that are and can be involved in supporting these kind of instruments and transactions. But maybe to highlight one group that I think is quite overlooked in a lot of decisions, and that's local level actors and their role. So they can play a central role, and they should be playing a central role in local ownership of the process and the outcomes. So that includes in the development of the climate and nature KPIs in partnership with the national entities, advocating for debt instruments by highlighting evidence of the benefits of inclusive climate and nature outcomes on the ground, engaging and leading on climate and nature activities to be undertaken as part of the KPI implementation process, and participatory monitoring, reporting, and verification at the local level to ensure citizens' accountability and transparency. So there's a number of ways that they should and can be involved. So moving forward, I would say some of the key aspects are trying to build this into the financial architecture and work towards a programmatic approach to build on the experience of recent swaps. So we have, some of our panel members will be discussing some of these recent swaps, Seychelles, Belize, Barbados, Ecuador, and create the right incentives in the system. So creating incentives across actors, so bilateral creditors can use their political capital to get other creditors involved, crowd in finance and de-risk transactions by providing guarantees and political risk insurance. Multilateral creditors need to be integrating climate vulnerability into their operations and building in support for these types of instruments. And incentives can also be strengthened for private sector engagement, including sort of things like clauses of comparability and maybe also aspects like bringing them into the clean development mechanism credits or these kind of approaches. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Seychelles. Passing over to Andrew.
Thanks. So again, I'm Andrew Deutz with the Nature Conservancy. I want to build on the two previous presentations, talk a little bit about TNC's experience and some of the transactions we've done, some of the lessons we've learned, how the overall conversation around debt and climate finance has evolved in the last couple of years, and what we see as the potential going forward to scale this. So let me start, like Laila did part of my presentation already, so I'll make that quick, in describing, or sort of say, debt swaps 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0, right? Debt swaps 1.0 are the Tropical Forest Conservation Act type bilateral debt swaps that we saw starting in the 1980s. It's tended to be fairly small, and it was bilateral debt, so government-to-government debt being swapped in exchange for conservation commitments. What I would call Debt for Nature Swap 2.0 is the transaction we did with Seychelles in 2015, 2016, which I'll let Didier will explain more. And there it was Paris Club debt that we were able to purchase on the open market and refinance with them at a lower level of interest rates, some of the savings then going into a trust fund to pay for conservation activities. But again, it was official debt, but it was purchased on the market. What I would call then Debt for Nature Swaps 3.0 started with the transaction we did first in Belize, and now we've replicated the model with Barbados and Gabon. And then our colleagues at Pew have done that similar structuring in Ecuador, I'm sure we'll hear more about. And that was actually using commercial debt. In the case of Belize, we managed to structure an arrangement to buy back $550 million worth of commercial debt. It was actually Belize's entire Eurobond portfolio that was out there in the market, trading at a discount. So it cost us about $360 million to purchase that back. And then they issued new debt to the market with a credit guarantee in the form of political risk insurance from the U.S. Development Finance Corporation. The thing that made the whole transaction work was that credit enhancement, and because that got them, they were on the verge of default, that got them to a AA- credit rating, which means it's investment grade for institutional investors. So all of a sudden, private investors were willing to come back in, and they, Belize, were paying a lower interest rate. By refinancing their entire commercial debt portfolio, it did a little bit to improve their overall debt situation. It did a lot to improve their climate and conservation finance situation, right? So it moved them from 110% to 100% debt to GDP ratio. That's a material improvement. That still didn't move them into debt sustainability. So I want to be clear that this mechanism is probably not the solution to unsustainable debt loads. It is a tool in the toolbox and can make a contribution for countries that are at or near debt distress levels. It also, as a consequence of the deal and the improvement of their balance sheet, it improved their credit rating a couple of notches, which meant that subsequent financial transactions or debt issuances would potentially lower their cost of capital. So it was a good deal from a financial perspective, a much better deal from a conservation finance perspective. It generated about $160 million we're projecting over a 15-year time period that's going into marine conservation, primarily around protection of the Mesoamerican reef, which is a critical ecological asset for the economy because the major foreign currency earning sectors are tourism and fisheries, both of which are highly dependent on the ecosystem services provided by that reef. So improving the protected areas system in line with the 30 by 30 target commitment and improving the protection status and ecological status of the reef, it makes a significant economic contribution. When you add up the 4 transactions we've done across Belize, Barbados, Gabon, and Seychelles, it's a total of about $1.2 billion worth of debt that's been refinanced, with new issuance at about $1 billion. The savings over a 15 to 20-year period is generating about $400 million in conservation and climate finance. And because these have all been marine-focused deals, is leading to the establishment, and each of these have committed to using the money to implement the 30 by 30 commitment in their marine realm. It's leading to the creation of new protected areas of around 500,000 square kilometers. In the case of Seychelles, their total area under conservation and management is about the size of Germany. So like Seychelles is always characterized as a small island development state. We like to think of it as a large ocean state. When you add up the size of its EEZ, it's a big chunk of the ocean. We've now seen our colleagues at Pew replicate this structure at a much larger scale. Was it $1 billion something that was refinanced in Ecuador? We'll hear more about that. So the model is starting to be replicated, which is great. And what we're looking forward to is how to actually scale it up much more significantly. We've done some calculations on what's potential. There's about $2.2 trillion in developing country debt out there right now in low and middle income countries that's potentially addressed. Of that, we think that about a third, or roughly $650 to $800 billion of that debt is addressable for this kind of financing model or refinancing model. Taken to scale, we think that could generate something like $160 billion in financing for climate and conservation outcomes over a 15 to 20 year period. So we're talking 10 to 12 billion dollars a year as the sort of maximum potential of this instrument. That's not going to solve the climate finance problem, but again, it makes a material contribution for a number of these countries towards their implementation of their NDCs and their Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework commitments. To get there, we think there are 4 critical elements that need to be addressed, and we're seeing a lot of progress. So in the last 2 years, as we've been talking about how to scale it, the 4 key things that we thought needed to be done is 1, needed to see a lot of interest and demand from developing countries to do this. We've seen that manifest in a number of ways. The vulnerable 20 countries have listed this as one of the tools they want in the toolbox. Right? And actually, there was a declaration on credit enhancement from the MDBs last week, which the V20 endorsed, is we want to see the MDBs improve this mechanism. The Coalition on Sustainable Debt, which came out last year in Sharm el-Sheikh, which is primarily a coalition of African finance ministers, have also endorsed this as, again, one of the tools in the toolbox. Not a comprehensive solution to climate finance or debt refinancing, but a tool in the toolbox. So we're seeing clearly that there's interest among the debtor countries for this to scale. Second question is there interest from the investor community? And we've worked now with 2 different investment banks in placing these new debt issuances in the marketplace, Bank of America and Credit Suisse. The feedback we've gotten from them and from the other institutional investors that are working in this space is, bring it on. We like, it fits, because it's a fixed income instrument, it fits the asset allocation class for many emerging market investors, and it fits the asset allocation class for many ESG investors. So as long as these deals can be structured at investment grade, in the AA- range or better, there appears to be, from what we've seen in the market, more than enough interest for the private finance to purchase these instruments linked to the KPIs. The limiting factor, though, this is issue number 3, is the ability of the public sector institutions to provide sufficient credit enhancement. So far, 2 institutions have done this, the U.S. Development Finance Corporation and the Inter-American Development Bank. To make this really go to scale, though, we need those institutions to get much better at providing more efficient and effective credit enhancement, preferably in the form of guarantees rather than political risk insurance, because the transaction costs are lower with guarantee mechanisms. The 4th critical element we think is the capacity in country to help both with the implementation of the commitments, the monitoring of those commitments, and the ability to report back to the investors that the KPIs are being met. UNDP is starting to work in that space in a couple of countries in Latin America that have done new sustainability-linked bond issuances, Chile and Uruguay. Like to see that expand, but we think we need more capacity from TNC. In each of the countries we've done it in places where the Nature Conservancy works, so we work on the ground to help with the implementation. But again, we only work in a limited number of countries, so in order for this work, there needs to be a set of constituencies out there with the ability to facilitate the implementation and the monitoring work. So there's a real role for civil society. So developing country interest, check. Investor appetite, check. Credit enhancement needs work. It fits into the overall World Bank MDB evolution roadmap that we're seeing evolve. But we're not seeing appetite from the donor countries to those institutions to increase the balance sheets of those institutions to scale up their guarantee capacity. So the first question is, can we get more efficient and effective use of the guarantee facilities that already exist? Positive signal that we saw last week was a number of the MDBs signed on to a joint declaration on credit enhancement where they established a task force co-chaired by the 2 organizations that have done this so far, IDB and U.S. Development Finance Corporation, to work together to scale up, to learn lessons, see if they can leverage each other's balance sheets and scale this up. So hopefully we'll start to see an expansion of the mechanism. Maybe some point in the future we'll see increase in the balance sheet capacity on guarantees. And we're starting to work with those groups and others on trying to build out a toolkit for the capacity building, both for the debt offices in developing country finance ministries that would do the issuances to bring them up to speed, and work with the civil society partners and others on what the deal structures looks like, and then what the implementation and reporting verification mechanisms would look like. So we see a pathway to scale, but still a lot of work to get done. The last point I want to just leave you with is, I say, like, we see a lot of opportunity to scale this, but again, we as the Nature Conservancy approach this primarily as a climate and conservation finance mechanism. It has a contribution to make in some circumstances to improving the debt sustainability for some countries, particularly for countries that are at the cusp of market access and need that help in the form of credit enhancement. And we're seeing signals from the private market that the link to climate and nature KPIs is attractive because it fits various asset allocation classes. So we see opportunity for it to scale. I don't know if we're going to get to the total of max out at 650 to 800 billion over the next decade or so, but we see huge opportunity for it to scale. Let me stop there. We'll pass it on. We'll come back.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Passing over to Didier with his experiences from the Seychelles.
Can I have
The ticker?
control? Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening side event. I will be speaking about the Seychelles experience in doing the debt swap that we did back in 2015 together with the TNC. The reason, one of the most important things somebody might be asking is why did Seychelles did a debt swap at that time? You know, for many people until now, debt swap is still very strange, and it's not the normal thing that countries does, because when we went to the Ministry of Finance, they told us, well, the best thing is to restructure debts and get debt relief. That's the best thing to do. But we had seen, because I was the Minister of Environment at the time, and for us, from the environment side, we saw that there was a lot of benefits in raising the kind of money that we needed to finance environment programs. And and the money was not coming easily from both the Ministry of Finance, because small countries does not have a lot of money. Most of the money goes towards, you know, the social programs, education, schools, building infrastructure, and several services that the country needs. So environment is very much down the line. It's not up on the top of the agenda. And, but one thing that Seychelles still had a lot of was debt. So if you could renegotiate the debt and get part of that money put into a trust fund that can be used to scale up or co-finance projects on the ground in the country, that was to us within the Ministry of Environment a big plus. So we decided to push and until the Ministry of Finance and also the government agreed that this was the way to go, and that we need to find a way so that we can use our debt to redirect that debt money so that we can invest it in nature conservation and also in climate adaptation. So in Rio +20 in 2012, we did a side event, and Andrew was there. We, together with GLISPA, it was a great, GLISPA is the Global Island Partnership Organization. And that side event, Seychelles made a pledge. It was done by the Vice President. He said, okay, if we can raise $2 million a year for us to finance nature conservation and climate adaptation, then we are prepared to commit 30% of our EEZ as protected area. So that was way before the 30 plus 30 times 30 that CBD has just come up with. And we were talking about that already in 2012. And so Seychelles got, after that, we got together with TNC and we formed a partnership. And we started doing the preparation. For you to do a debt swap, first of all, you need to do quite a bit of preparation work. You need to be able to identify which debts that are eligible for you to do debt swap with, which ones will qualify, who will you be doing the debt swap with, and which ones are likely to succeed and which ones will probably not succeed. And also you need to look at the feasibility of whether you will be able to pay back the debt. Where will the money be coming from, and so on, because you need to be able to answer those questions when you go and meet the creditors. They would ask you these things, and you need to be able to convince them that you've done your homework. So we worked on that, and originally the plan was for us to swap about $18 million of debt with the Paris Club. We identified the Paris Club as the main body with whom that we should be doing the debt swap. And the key countries that we had a lot of debt with was France, UK, Italy, Belgium, Germany, and I think also Spain and Japan. So, so we, in 2014, we started the first discussions with the Paris Club, and we offered them, we presented our case, and there was some interest from them at the beginning, but for them also, the whole thing is that the debt swap was not, especially for ocean and climate adaptation, it was not really, out there yet. It had not picked up. In fact, we were basically the first who were talking about that, at that point. And also, we had a disadvantage in that Seychelles, back in 2008, when there was the global financial crisis, we had default on our payments because, most countries were in dire straits at that time. And we got debt relief from the Paris Club, from most of these countries that I've just mentioned, about 45% debt relief from those countries, which meant that within a couple of years, within 6 years, 5 years, we were back in front of their door and asking for another debt relief and to do a debt swap. So definitely there was an apprehension, they said, not them again. So, but they were prepared to consider it. So, but by the end of 2014, we had got agreement with them that, yes, they were prepared to do a debt swap, although not all the countries that were with whom we had debt with, all the creditor countries within the Paris Club. But 4 of them agreed, and a number of them were also interested to do it. So in the end, we agreed. To cut a long story short, we came down to 30 million, but we did a debt swap for 21.6 million, mostly because of the amount of money we could raise at that time. And so the deal was for 21.6 million US dollars with 5% debt relief. And Seychelles got the support from TNC and was able to raise $5 million US dollars from philanthropists, even from Leonardo DiCaprio, which gave Seychelles as a touristic country a lot of publicity, and which was great. And also we got 15.2 million as a concessionary loan from TNC at 3% interest for us to pay back over 10 years. So all the philanthropist money and also the debt is basically not pardoned, but it has been redirected for us to pay it back in Seychelles rupees, in local currency. And the money is used to finance environmental activities, mainly nature conservation, around marine and oceanic activities, but also climate change adaptation. So what were the benefits that Seychelles got out of it? Well, first of all, you get the debt relief or debt redirection, which means that Seychelles doesn't have to find the amount of foreign exchange for it to repay, the same amount of foreign exchange for it to repay the debt that it would have had to do had it not done the debt swap. As I said, a large component of that money that it had to pay now will have to be paid in local currencies, which is basically reinvesting money from the Seychelles government into the country itself instead of it leaving the country and going somewhere else. And then through the debt swap, we also, because the money was going into a trust fund, and with the interest, it comes to about 17 million Seychelles will be able to raise over 20 years. That will go towards climate adaptation and nature conservation. And also the repayment is over a longer period of time, which is over 20 years. And at the same time, the SECAT, which is the trust fund that we created, Seychelles Climate and Conservation Adaptation Fund, is now able to raise 280,000 US dollars every year that is put at the disposal of the locals, be it companies, individuals, and NGOs, for them to bid for, for them to get grants, for them to invest in activities within their communities and businesses and so on. And at the same time, we are, it helped us prepare for the next step, which was to do a 15 million US dollars worth of sovereign blue bonds in 2018. So what was the outcome of the debt swap? Well, first of all, as I said, we were able to, we had the financial benefits that we got from the debt swap. But apart from that, like Andrew has highlighted, Seychelles did a marine special plan, which, for its whole EEZ, which covers the whole EEZ of Seychelles, which is 1.4 million square kilometers. And it had generated so much information and so much interest in the marine environment and ocean as it has never done before. And there's a lot of young people, especially young ladies, who are now taking up marine science as a profession and going into that sort of research. And out of that, 400,000 square kilometers has now been designated as a marine protected areas. That was done in 2020. So it's 10 years ahead of the CBD 30x30 framework. And also we've met the Archie targets, we've met the Sustainable Development Goal on oceans. So we're already way ahead of that. And we're also investing a lot of money in coastal zone management, in sustainable fisheries management, and developing the necessary policies and management plans for all these different coastal activities that we're doing, including adaptation to climate change. So over 20 years, Seychelles will be able to invest 9.4 million US dollars in marine conservation and climate adaptation, and at the same time raise up to 6.6 million, which will be put in an endowment fund, which will become then available at the end of that 20 years so that there is continuity. So what were the lessons learned? Well, first of all, preparation is vital. You need to prepare very well. You can't just walk into the creditors' rooms and just try and tell them a story. You need to know exactly what you're going to tell them and make sure that you can convince them. Secondly, you need to select your creditors well. You need to know who you're dealing with, and there may be the need that there should be diplomatic at the highest level, head of state to head of state. Discussions might need to take place, and also you need to identify the exact debt that are eligible for swapping. And then, of course, you need to design your whole negotiations well and make sure that it's well timed. In the case of Seychelles, we did it at the time of the Paris COP, which was being held in Paris, of course, and France was ahead of it. So France played a big role in getting the debt swap agreed, because for them it was a big plus, to come up with something innovative during the time that they are holding the COP. So sometimes the timing can also be key to the whole thing. And then you need a lot of patience. Debt swap can take time. The creditors might not say yes at the first time. There might be a lot of back and forth, a little bit like the negotiations here at COP. You need time and patience. Scale is important. The size of the debt swap is important for you to do it properly. And you need to get the Ministry of Finance on board. And getting Ministry of Finance on board is not always easy because they have their way of working and they do not necessarily sign on to all these environment stories that you will go and tell them. And of course, high-level commitments at the highest level. And also you need broad stakeholder agreement. Everybody must be on board. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Didier, for this country's perspective. And now our last speaker, Danielle. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the kind invitation. I know it's late. It's one day before the end of the COP, so I really appreciate your time and being here. I'm going to try to run through my slides as soon as I can so that we can actually have a conversation. Perhaps to start, I should say at the outset that I think that we are sitting here because we believe that this can be a tool that can help to deliver and resolve the climate finance, right? There is a group of civil society that doesn't believe that it can play a role. And because we believe it can play a role, I think that our idea is how can we improve it? I think the question is not whether it should, I think it should. The question is what, and then it is important that we also discuss who wins what, how much, and why. I think that will help us to have a more clarity in terms of how to reduce transaction costs and how can it make work for the countries. Before I jump into the presentation, may I ask how many of you are experts on climate finance? At the back, we have two. How many are experts in finance at large? 3. And the rest of you guys are negotiators or simply interested audience? Thank you very much. It's just, I just want to manage the messaging, right? This has a lot of concepts, underlying discussions about the economics, the governance of it, and so I just want to be, I'm going to try to be very broad. And for any of you that would like to have a deeper, a more close dive, we can talk in the sides. So today I bring to you a presentation acting in my capacity as the co-chair of the expert panel of the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. And as you may know, we have faced several concerns and credibility issues with respect to this market. So perhaps this is a summary of the story on how we are trying to address those that perhaps can derive some lessons on how can we address the increasing concerns with respect to the swaps, right, on a constructive basis. So at the end of the presentation, I will hope that we can establish a link, not only in how can we make this work, but not only with respect to the debt swaps, but also to, through the debt swaps, increase the available finance for climate action, and particularly how it can be linked back to a generation of credits. Can we please move? Please count the 10 minutes from now on, because otherwise I'm going to be losing that. Okay, thanks. I got it. So very briefly about what we do in the Integrity Council, then I move on how can we replicate the principle-based approach that we have taken on that side of the river on this other side, and whether or not it makes any sense to you all. So first, our theory of change is pretty simple. You build integrity and scale will follow. We understand the voluntary carbon market is not the solution to the climate problem. We understand its limitations, but we believe it's one available tool that is ready to deploy private finance, no loans, no debts, but real private finance to green growth, to employment, and to facilitate access to technologies. But it shouldn't replace the decarbonization efforts that countries, companies, and the entire at large should aim to have. So understanding the role of the instrument is of particular importance, right? Sometimes we want it to fit other needs, other goals, but it doesn't. And so the way that we have approached, or we are trying to resolve the credibility issues, is by creating an ecosystem of integrity. and offers an end-to-end solution to integrity. We work on the supply side. The VCMI, which is a Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, works in the demand side, and that is how corporates can use the credits and can make rational claims that do not reflect on greenwashing or anything like that. So, because credibility issues are whether the carbon credit is really additional, and that is whether it's finance that would otherwise not occur, and therefore enables activities that would otherwise not happen, but also we need to make sure that it is correctly used, right? So that these are mechanisms that were created under the convention or associated to the climate goal because they should be fit for purpose, right? They need to deliver on a public good. But we have also partnered broadly to the SBTI, to ESG protocol. At the end of the day, perhaps what we are trying to replicate is what happened with the Task Force on Climate Disclosures for Risks, right? It was soft law, that then it was taken by jurisdictions, and now it's becoming a regular practice in every other jurisdiction. Our framework that was released in June has now been taken on board by the UK, by Singapore, and the United States through the US Commission on Future Exchange, right? So they are deriving information from our rule book, and what will happen across time is that if every jurisdiction does this, if the 6.4 discussions under the convention do this, we are creating and enabling interoperability across the different crediting mechanisms, the different platforms, and with that, at the end of the day, you are resolving the issue of fungibility, right? When we talk about one emission reduction, doesn't matter where you generated, it is the same. If you resolve the fungibility issue and it has public trust and that it doesn't associate harm to people and the society, and you measure, identify the impacts on sustainable development, you can jump to a different discussion, which is how to achieve liquidity, right? Whether this homogeneous now commodity can be brought into future contracts that can facilitate access upfront finance, right? Then you can talk about derivatives, you can talk about price forwarding, and that is receiving payment in advance. Those are financial tools that can become available, but you need to fix the essential elements of trust in the market. So thinking on this and the theory of change that we have that is targeting to reduce these emissions, the principles that we put together addresses three great areas, large areas. One is the governance of it, right? So we regulate or we self-regulate carbon crediting programs, right? We need to understand how they make decisions, whether there is a control over the conflict of interest at the board, whether there is a transparency and there is public consultation on how to develop the standards, how they manage the registry, and whether there is robust third-party validation and verification to attest that not only we believe that they are doing the right job, but it's actually a process, a due diligence process to check that the project developer has aligned with the standard and the standard is observing this correctly. On emissions impact, we need to understand whether there is additionality, right? And that is a central concept in the climate discussions because there is a whole framework, right? So additionality in this case means, again, this activity will not happen without the additional flow of revenue from the sales of the credits. And this needs to be considered when the project is being designed, not afterwards. You cannot go about claiming credits when you have already implemented your activity. But it also has to be permanent. Perhaps you have followed the entire discussion in The Guardian and the other papers where we cannot really attest for permanence, right? Whether in forests, there may be forest fires or whatsoever, but there are ways to manage that risk, right? In financial terms, you can aggregate different type of credits, you can pull that risk into different mechanisms, and you can have buffers. There are ways to ensure that risk, let's say like that, or resolve it, or de-risk it. There has to be robust quantification and about double counting. In this case, it's double counting of emissions. There could be double counting of finance as well, because sometimes if this comes from government donors, it can also be linked back to ODA, but it's no ODA, right? It's a market transaction. And finally, on sustainable development, we have introduced the need to have strong safeguards, social and environmental, including free, prior, and informed consent. And for those that follow these discussions, you know that is not easy to implement. This is really costly, right? So then when you have a price cost for the ton of carbon that we have observed in the market. The difference between compliance and voluntary market is huge, right? $100 a ton in compliance market, and the voluntary market on average between $5 to $10. Everything that I'm telling you is really costly to implement, but it needs to be built there so that the whole market operates under integrity. So jumping into our discussion, if I can summarize what we have tried to do, if we want to frame the high integrity of the credits to scale up the finance, we can perhaps think that the ICBCM, and I'm saying this on my personal capacity, that's why the logos are not there, right? This is my own reflection to share with you. So the ICBCM effect has been, we have introduced a principle-based approach to integrity. We have informed our effort with best practice, not only within the carbon market, but we have outreach to other financial sectors, including the IFC standards for safeguards and so on. But we have also looked and reflected on the green bond principles on how they recommend that the structured debt instruments should be issued, right? They are not law, but the EU taxonomy has also reflected in the green bond principles because it derives lessons. So at the essence, this generates information so that we can differentiate what is high integrity, what is not, right? And we have resolved perhaps the fungibility problem. We are striving to work with others to work to resolve the liquidity issue, but at the end, we are also cross-working into the compatibility component of it. Voluntary carbon market is only $2 billion. It can increase to $50 billion, but sustainable debt is already $900 billion, ESG emissions. And if you go to sustainable finance and impact finance, it can get up to $3 trillion. So those are more or less the magnitude, order of magnitudes that we would like to see in climate to really do a meaningful change. So the aim for this has been perhaps to get into the agenda of institutional investors, right? So Andrew essentially said they look for good rating, right? And they look for opportunities. In the case of credits, it is on the best interest of the institutional investor to remove the climate risk from the portfolio. And that's what we have seen the G funds and other licenses coming together because they say, we want to decarbonize our portfolio and have a meaningful contribution to the environment. So perhaps the credits can be one way to do it because institutional investors, they hold debt and equity both in the private sector and on the sovereign sector. And if they can use this new financial asset to de-risk their portfolio, right? They can. We have seen already start the charter when they provide a green loan and you don't deliver on the key performance indicators, you can use the credits to do it. So taking this on board, what we can do on debt swaps, perhaps if we recognize that there are credibility issues, I think the first thing to do is that we need to acknowledge there are, right? If we continue to think that there are very best practice already available, I don't think we are moving forward. The second is, why is the case? Because for these deals to work, the country needs to face high risk of default, high political risk, so that the face value of the sovereign bonds in the secondary market are already transacting between 40 to 60% of the discounted price. That's where the deal can take place. Otherwise, it's not attractive for whoever is holding the sovereign bond to transact. There are expected returns of that. It's not an act of charity, right? Nobody's going to entertain a financial transaction on the basis that I will be losing money. I think we need to understand that component. So if we can attempt to build a principle-based approach, an end-to-end integrity associated with debt swaps, as we have seen in the voluntary carbon market, perhaps we can be compatible not only to provide finance at the margins, but actually resolve the problem of debt, because otherwise we are essentially going around under the same issue. And I say that this is not an act of charity because it has been proven with empirical evidence, not in the most recent debt swaps. From very longer in times, in 1970s, it has been demonstrated that you can transact and do the same transaction that the swaps do for the buyback at even higher levels of discount, right? So the entire operation that is strict, high costly, and achieves a result, it can be obtained in different ways, right? So because of time, I will save some other information for questions, But let me perhaps finish with the proposed way forward. I think what has been it's like we prepare presentations together. It's some of the same argument. I was amazed. So my thesis is that we can achieve a high integrity depth conversion framework, as we have done on the voluntary carbon space, if we can have a principles-based approach on management of the governance of the swap operation, the accountability, right? So far, it's completely absent of accountability. For the issuance of the bonds that private actors are doing, most of the cases is registered in Ireland. There's no way to check on how that operation is done, right? And the trust funds are set up in Delaware, which is also a jurisdiction that has a very limited access in terms of information, and there is no oversight that countries can do down the road on that management. Then the second is transparency. I will not go into the details of each one because of time, but there are several provisions to do this and how it's done. In many of the countries, different from Seychelles that approach TNC, in all countries, the NGOs approach the governments, and the governments provide a non-objection letter that allows them to start conducting negotiations and to subsidize the operation by accessing risk capital, right? Because setting up the LLC and setting up the special purpose vehicle comes to a cost, financial cost, legal cost. So in the case of Ecuador, for instance, there were $2 million that flew through different investment funds that originated by European Union commissions. So it is public funding subsidizing private operations that provides a service to developing countries. Whether that can fit the framework under the UNFCCC is very hard to understand and see. But we need to explore the ways. And again, fiscal impact, it is really a reduction on the debt stock or not. It is changing in concessionality terms, in time frames. What is the gap between the interest rate of the bond that is issued and the interest rate of the loan? In the case of Seychelles, it's very good. It's 3%, as you heard. Other countries are reaching loans of 6, 7, 8%, which you can also access to other type of credit facilities. And the budget authority over the funds is of importance, right? This will not occur if the intermediaries will not hold the responsibility for then managing the trust funds. But that comes to a price, right? The government needs to decide whether it's willing to cede that authority over budget and over policy decisions and to share it with a specific group of people that is sitting in one table that not necessarily reflects the interests of the entire society. We have different frameworks under the UNFCCC. We have the NDC. It has to be consulted. It has to be worked out. So perhaps under climate finance, this could be different. And in terms of emissions impact, again, the country needs to decide whether or not it aligns with the NDC, whether it contributes to implement one of the specific sectors or whether it can be targeted, how the MRV will be conducted on the use of the funds and on the effectiveness of the use of the funds, whether the safeguards are implemented on SDG impact. So I will stop there, again, because of time. I apologize because of the day. But if at the end of the day, the swaps are managed sovereignly, right, and it's the country who issues the bond, not the privates through a special purpose vehicle, but the country issues the bond under their sovereign green bond frameworks, they will be able to mobilize the resources to do the buyback directly and perhaps allocate this into the trust funds that we have already set up for climate purposes. Many of the countries, they already have set up private-led trust funds to manage funds transparently. If that works, then you talk about an instrument that, if it is related with key performance indicators, can finance the NDC, can also finance JRED, mobilizing upfront finance, and then you can use the credits generated through the JRED to pay back the loan. So then you are using new financial asset to pay the loan, and you don't use the regular budget, the current budget, to pay the loan. So that's, I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. So before we go into our discussion with you in the audience, I want to say thank you to all the speakers for these exciting insights into your individual perspectives on debt for climate swaps and their potential future. And before I give also the floor to the audience here that didn't provide a question with the tool, I will forward the question that we received online, which is, a key challenge that we are seeing in the low availability of finance for adaptation. A key challenge is that we see low availability for finance for adaptation. How can DFC swaps support the mobilization of private investment in adaptation? Anyone? And there was no person targeted for this question, so maybe the person in the audience had an indication who we want to put the question to. If not, I would assign it. Or, yeah.
Perhaps
maybe.
I can jump into it. So again, the right tool for the right purpose, right? If we are mobilizing finance to deliver on emissions impact, that's one approach. The indicators will be different and the performance achieved will be different, and therefore you can mobilize different type of finance. The mechanisms to do it may be the same, right? You can still do sovereign bonds issuance, can convene some of the current holders of commercial debt to perform the swap, and you can direct that to adaptation if they agree and the trust fund that is set up accepts to do it. I think that it is feasible. Some other country has proposed to do it for loss and damage, and I think it would be a great tool to use to fund the loss and damage fund. I have read the report from the Nordic Council. They recommend this as one of the central tools, so it may be a sign-up from Nordic countries that they will be willing to take the debt that they hold on developing countries. I would like to explore. But again, it has to first, as Minister suggested, you need to understand what sections of the debt can be subject to the process, whether it's public or commercially held, and how can you go about doing it. And it depends on the mutual interest, perhaps it could be explored. But whether the tool can provide funds for it, yes. But to be frank, even impact investors, they are seeking to identify where is that they derive most alignment of outcomes toward their strategies. So if you identify any specific northern country that would like to support an adaptation, perhaps it can work.
Thank you so much. Then we can receive questions from the audience. Any question here?
Hello, everyone. I'm Huda from Madagascar. I would like to ask one thing. Mr. Daniel said that one of the key conditions that make it work is the high level risk of non-payment in some way. So I think that country, there is higher probability for a country to pay for another country than to pay for themselves. I mean, for an entity inside the country. So I would like to ask also to the former minister, how do you secure the fact that the government will pay its debt to the trust fund?
You want to take it?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. I think it's a very good one. Governments have to pay their debt. They can't get away from it. That's the reality, because if you don't, then you get downgraded by the international, by the Fitch and Moody's and all the others. And of course, once you get downgraded, then it means that you cannot borrow. Or if you borrow, you have to borrow at a higher price. So, and no government wants to be in that position. So government do pay. They will pay, no matter which administration it is. If there's a change, like if there's election, there's a change in government, the next administration can't walk away from it. They still have to they still have to pay.
Perhaps I can add, if I understood correctly your question. There is a beautiful instrument that is called a contract. And there is a loan contract in most of these operations. And here's the beauty of the loan contract. It is not set up by the NGOs. It is set up by a facility agent. In most of the time, it's a private bank, a very heavy private bank. And in most of the time, it's a private bank that is also holding debt of the country. So that I personally think that in a regular transaction that should not occur, because the facility agent should be completely independent from the transaction. And when you look through the loan, there are several conditionalities that will force you to do what you set up to do, not because you want to. And that's regular, that's business, right? If you need to come into terms and agreements. But here's the additional beauty of that contract. It also activates collective clauses. So if the country would like to pay back the loan earlier, default. Not only on this loan, but default in your entire public debt. So that's part of the perverse incentives that I indicated, right? And we have seen this in every single contract, because otherwise there is a real risk that the country will not deliver. So how we manage that? Perhaps the de-risking of insurance. But when we talk about political risk, I think we need to be clear. That is a risk that is born in the country and can be faced by the actor, right? So the guarantee that the government pays to the Inter-American Development Bank in most of the cases is against itself, right? We are insuring the private actors because the transaction has a risk. It's a fair thing, but that's what it means, right? And perhaps that will explain why the transaction will work in the long period of time when you will face, on top of that, several changes in governments, and we know how change in government happens, right? They want to restructure everything, they want to change policies and so on, particularly in developing countries that have weak institutionality.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. My question is to the former minister. You said a key component was that a large part of the debt was payable in local currency. And I wanted to know how important that was and what were the negotiations involved in getting them to agree to that. Thank you.
Yeah, developing countries, when they have external debt, you have to earn the foreign exchange first. And then taking a chunk of that money every year for you to repay external debt is a huge burden on all developing countries. So now, and one of the things, and I think also it's connected with the first question, countries are always looking for concessionary loans, to bring down the cost of repayment and all that. So now if somebody redirect that debt from being a foreign exchange repayment debt to one that is local, then it's always easy for government to find local money for them to repay their debt. And in repaying, the money goes into a trust fund, like in the case of Seychelles, and that money is made available by that trust fund for grants. So anybody in Seychelles can apply every year. There's a call for proposal, and anybody can apply for these grants for them to finance projects. Either it's commercial projects that they need to do research, or it could be research for the sake of research, or it could be adaptation projects for a community or something like that. But definitely there's a huge benefit in paying in local currencies than having to take it from money that you have to earn first coming from outside. That's a huge burden, and that's something that most countries want to avoid.
Thank you.
Thank you for this insightful panel. Julia Neal here from Go-to-Markets, one of the market players in the climate finance and capital markets. My first question will be, since this swap happened before the ICVCM was created, I believe, what types of vehicle did you use when you made the transaction? And second question, regarding the Article 6, can you develop a bit better, a bit more actually, how this mechanism could work with the 6.2 and the 6.4? Thank you.
I think this question was directed to Daniel, no?
To me?
I mean, Daniel and maybe Andrew?
Tell you what, I'll take
Yeah.
the question on the structure, you can take the Article 6 question.
Yes, yeah.
So, in each of these cases where we're dealing with commercial debt, we've created a special purpose vehicle. And there's actually two sides to the transaction. So one is a loan to the special purpose vehicle, which is then used to buy back the debt in the marketplace. And then the second piece of the transaction is the government paying that back and then issuing new debt into the marketplace. I apologize that I didn't bring slides. I probably should have to show the financial transaction structuring. But if you go on our website, nature.org, we have detailed case studies on the Barbados and Belize transactions that show the transaction structure of the use of the SPV and both what in theory is the blue loan and the blue bond issuance.
Okay. Article 6, Article 2. 6.2 and 6.4. So 6.4 will be a new crediting mechanism, right? The new version of this, the clean development mechanism. Currently, they are discussing methodologies and hopefully an SD tool. Whenever it's finished, and they hope perhaps Q1, Q2, they will start receiving applications for projects. Those projects will generate carbon credits at some point of time. We will hope that the UNFCCC has demonstrated that they can deliver high integrity, that's for sure. They are a bit costly, but very high integrity. And 6.2 is mostly transactions between countries, right? And under 6.2, you open the possibility for ITMOs, which are international transfer mitigation units that can occur between jurisdictions, and we have seen some countries coming together and doing it. Let's say that those, in this particular case, because I think that 6.4 follows what I have already described, but under 6.2, let's say that Japan gets an agreement with Ghana, right, for 6.2, and Ghana will deliver the credits. Let's say also that Japan is holding debt of Ghana. They may consider linking both instruments, right? High integrity carbon credits and the debt swaps. And the credit could become a vehicle of repayment instead of money exchange. I don't know, is that okay? Okay.
Great. Do we have time for one more question? Okay, thanks.
Oseni is my name, from Nigeria, and my question will go to the minister. Please, in the course of trying to achieve the debt swap, is there any international organization that could serve as a facilitator to assisting you in the course of trying to achieve your debt swap?
Well, TNC is here. Yeah, well, there's several now. There's few charitable organizations, but there's also, I think the one with the most experience is the Nature Conservancy, and Andrew is here. He can give you a lot of information. And it is normally advisable that you do have a partner with the right knowledge.
Well, since we have 2 minutes left, according to the clock, I think, Mr. Next, you had a question as well?
3.
Where's the microphone? Yeah.
Hi, it's Chris Palura from the Blockchain and Climate Institute, NGO. We talked about some of the verification that was required to make these products work. What does the panel think around the technology that's required, and what kinds of technologies are you looking at, or would you suggest, or could we work together on in order to bring that confidence to investors into the markets, both in the swap market, but also in the voluntary carbon markets as well? And that could be to Mr. Bridgetown or to the Minister as well.
Sorry, can you come again? It was not very clear for me.
Sorry. It was, what role can technology play in the verification of the voluntary carbon market, and also the verification of the swaps as well, to give confidence to investors and confidence in these markets so that they can be more easily procured?
Okay, I'll leave the carbon market to our friend here, Daniel. I believe at the beginning when you're doing the preparation and the design of the swap and all that, you need to bring in the expert, and of course, with experts, you need to bring in the technologies, and also so that you can do all the financial assessments and feasibility studies and the likes. And probably this is probably the area where the calculations need to be done properly, and you need to be able to do it properly. But also, I think the other part is the commitments. Like, for example, in Seychelles, we did the marine special planning. That definitely needs a lot of input, and that's where you need to have the right programs and technology for you to be able to do it properly. It took us almost 8 years to get it done, and it's not an easy job. So that's why I said patience is very important. So I won't take more time because I know there are others who would like to think. But I think these are the areas where you will need to bring in technology to help you out.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you so much. Maybe, Danielle, we can take it off stage and then move into the rest. Then I would close the panel and the session for today. Thank you, everyone, for the panelists, first of all, and then also to the audience for these many questions. I was really happy to see so many faces at this late time on a Sunday evening. Happy to have any further questions afterwards or for the information.